Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage co-founder and CEO of the Center for a New American Security, Ms. Michele Flournoy.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's really my honor and pleasure this evening to say a few words about Robert Gates, who will receive tonight the Distinguished International Leadership Award. President Obama called Robert Gates one of the nation's finest public servants. President George W. Bush said he's a man of integrity, candor, and sound judgment. He knows that the challenge of protecting our country is larger than any political party. Indeed, Secretary Gates has served 8 American presidents, both Republican and Democratic. Starting as a young second lieutenant in the Air Force and then as a career civil servant, he spent nearly 27 years as an intelligence professional, 9 of those in the White House at the National Security Council. Over time, he rose in the ranks to take on positions of greater and greater leadership and responsibility. He was assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Deputy National Security Advisor under General Scowcroft from 1989 to 1991. He was director of the CIA from 1991 to 1993 as we were coming out of the Cold War. And then after a stint as president of Texas A&M University, he was recalled to public service at the height of the Iraq War as the 22nd Secretary of Defense for the United States from December 2006 to July of 2011. The more you know Bob Gates, the easier it is to understand why so many presidents have sought the advice and counsel of this straight-talking Kansan. When I first walked into the Obama Transition Office, the headquarters in November of 2008, there was this gigantic banner over the foyer. You could not miss it. It was strategically placed, so anyone joining the transition team would see it. And it said, "No ego, no drama, this is not about you." It was a reminder to all of us who were serving in government that it wasn't about advancing our own careers, it was about serving the American people. I also came to understand how apt a description that was of the person who would become my boss, Bob Gates. For him, serving in government has never been about Bob Gates. It's been about duty, mission, and country. President Obama also called him a humble American patriot, and it's that rare mix of humility, commitment to public service, and deep love of country that has made so many presidents want him to be by their sides. Of course, they relied on him because he's also just so damn smart. As I quickly learned as his Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, he is an analyst at heart, and a brilliant one at that. Those of you who know him have undoubtedly witnessed his incisive intellect in action, able to take in massive amounts of material, sort the wheat from the chaff, ask just the right questions, and then hone in on a judgment. And 99.9% of the time, he hits the ball out of the park. Though he usually was the smartest and most experienced person in the room, he never acted like it. On the contrary, he started almost every meeting I ever had with him by listening. How rare is that in this town? Even when he had strong views on a subject, he kept an open mind. He solicited the views of others, always willing to hear new facts, to learn, question, consider dissent, reevaluate. His depth of experience, that incisive intellect, the impeccable judgment, often gave him the last word in the Oval Office or in the Situation Room. And more often than not, that last word carried the day. In addition to being a sage and sought-after presidential advisor, Bob Gates has distinguished himself as a leader, one of the most effective and important and impactful secretaries of defense ever to hold the office. On the wall behind his desk, he had hung a portrait of General George C. Marshall, the American statesman and soldier who famously said, "I will give you the best I have." And every day that Bob Gates occupied that office with General Marshall looking over his shoulder, he delivered on that pledge. He gave the best that he had. He had a vision of what he wanted to accomplish as Secretary of Defense. He set clear priorities. He used the priorities to drive his agenda for change in the Pentagon and in the broader interagency. He was clear with us as his subordinates about the roles he wanted us to play and the roles he didn't want us to play. And he empowered us to do our jobs and then held us accountable. He was willing to make the hard decisions, even when it included firing people, such as when it was discovered that wounded warriors at Walter Reed were being mistreated, or that the Air Force had inadvertently and unknowingly flown nuclear weapons all the way across the country. But he also understood that despite the tremendous authority vested in the Secretary of Defense, nothing gets done in Washington without engaging your stakeholders. And so he frequently exercised the art of inclusion, to leverage the good ideas of others and to generate buy-in. He reached out to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to forward a shared agenda on a way forward. He invested heavily in his relationships with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the vice chairman, the service chiefs, the combatant commanders, making them his partners in moving the department forward. He understood the critical role he had to play in civil-military relations, helping the commander-in-chief and the uniformed military better understand and respect one another. Sometimes he found himself in the rather uncomfortable position of being the ball-bearing in this relationship, under pressure from both sides. But his leadership helped to navigate that relationship through some tough and turbulent times. Most importantly, Secretary Gates knew how to inspire people, getting others to do their best work, always looking for the opportunities to encourage, to recognize, to reward excellence. And then there was his sense of humor. Although many see Bob Gates as the quintessential, buttoned-down, all-business professional, there's another side that's actually very funny and just a little bit irreverent. Whether it was gently teasing us about some aspect of our work, or recalling with childish glee that he had taken the motorcade through the drive-thru at Burger King, or offering us one of his infamous quips, one of my favorites, in trying to understand government behavior, never mistake malice for what is more likely explained as incompetence. He was a cut-up, and he inspired tremendous loyalty from his staff. On his very last day in office, literally thousands of civilians and military personnel lined the halls and stairways of the Pentagon to give him a standing ovation as he walked out of the building for the last time. Lastly, Secretary Gates understood the stewardship dimension of his job. He believed that his job was to leave the U.S. military stronger and better prepared for the future than when he found it. President Obama also said, "To know Bob is to know his profound sense of duty to country, to our security, and most of all, to the men and women who get up every day and put on America's uniform and put their lives on the line to keep us safe and keep us free." Indeed, Secretary Gates has been a champion of those men and women in uniform and their families. One of the things that's really distinguished him as Secretary of Defense was his deep sense of care for the members of the all-volunteer force, the less than 1% of Americans who raise their right hands and take an oath to support and defend the Constitution and this great nation. They were his most important stakeholders. And it was clear that he felt a profound personal sense of responsibility for them, especially those who were sent into harm's way. And this was evidenced in ways large and small, in the probing questions he would ask before signing any deployment order, the handwritten notes to every family of every fallen service member that he would write, to his countless visits to Dover Air Force Base to receive the remains of the fallen and comfort the families, his regular visits to Walter Reed, to Landstuhl, to visit with wounded warriors and encourage them and reassure them in their recovery, and to the lunches he hosted in his own SECDEF dining room for wounded warriors and their families. Those at the pointy end of the spear were always top of mind for Bob Gates when he was making tough decisions or driving change in the Pentagon. And when it came to making sure that our troops in the field had what they needed, watch out. Secretary Gates was a force of nature, moving heaven and earth and the Pentagon bureaucracy. You did not want to be the one standing between him and getting to his goal, whether it was getting more ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets to commanders downrange who needed it, whether it was accelerating the delivery of the MRAPs to protect our soldiers and Marines from IEDs, or whether it was surging medical evacuation, medevac resources to Afghanistan to ensure that any American wounded there would receive medical attention within that golden hour that often makes the difference between life and death. He simply refused to take no for an answer. And today, many American service members from Iraq and Afghanistan, many are alive today because of his dogged determination and his tireless advocacy on their behalf. So, ladies and gentlemen, each year the Atlantic Council's Distinguished International Leadership Award recognizes an individual who exemplifies the notion of service above self. There is no one who better fits this description than Secretary Bob Gates, a valued advisor to presidents from both sides of the aisle, an extraordinary leader, and a faithful steward of those who serve in uniform. His enduring commitment to public service, his record of accomplishment transcends partisanship, and it will long be remembered. Therefore, it's truly my honor and my pleasure to welcome to the stage to receive this award the Honorable Robert M. Gates.
It's just like a CIA award. They give it to you and then they take it away. Well, first of all, let me thank all of you for your endurance this evening on a weekday night. I would like to thank the Atlantic Council for this honor and thank all of you for attending this wonderful event tonight. I'm especially pleased that my best friend, most important mentor, and godfather of the Atlantic Council, Brent Scowcroft, is with us tonight. Brent. Thank you, Michele, for your generous remarks. I believe you should be the first woman to serve as Secretary of Defense. They may also offer my congratulations to the other award recipients this evening, Henry Kravis, Vittorio Grigolo, and General Joe Votel. Now, a little side story about Vittorio. I was giving a farewell dinner at Cafe Milano for General Pete Pace, who was going out as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the owner of Milano, Franco, came to Mary Claire Murphy and said, "We have this amazing young tenor sitting at the bar here in the restaurant. Would you like him to come sing? And Mary Claire, with her obvious eye for talent, said, well, of course. And so my first encounter with Vittorio was in 2007 when he sang at the farewell ceremony and dinner for General Pete Pace. Well, I was told that I'm expected to provide substantive acceptance remarks for this award, but to keep my substance to 5 minutes, which I might add would probably be short than everybody else's remarks tonight. But it does remind me of the occasion when George Bernard Shaw told a speaker he was introducing that he had to keep his remarks to 15 minutes. The speaker complained and said, how can I tell them everything I know in 15 minutes? And Shaw said, well, I advise you to speak very slowly. Almost exactly 5 years ago, in my last major speech as Secretary of Defense, I warned an audience in Brussels of a growing threat to the Atlantic Alliance, a threat from within. I said then, some 2 decades after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. share of NATO defense spending has now risen to more than 75%. The blunt reality is that there will be dwindling appetite and patience in the U.S. Congress and in the American body politic writ large to expend increasingly precious funds on behalf of nations that are apparently unwilling to devote the necessary resources to make the necessary changes to be serious and capable partners in their own defense. I continued, indeed, if current trends and the decline of European defense capabilities are not halted and reversed, future U.S. political leaders, those for whom the Cold War was not the formative experience that it was for me, may not consider the return on America's investment in NATO worth the cost. A lot of Europeans were offended by what I had to say. But that future day I warned of 5 years ago has arrived, with at least one presidential candidate urging reevaluation of our commitment to NATO, including our troop presence in Europe and in Asia as well, and other prominent voices, political voices in both political parties, sounding more isolationist with each passing day. We see a world where Russia and China are becoming ever more assertive, terrorist networks are actively targeting multiple European countries as well as the United States. Crises in the Middle East are destabilizing multiple states and flooding Europe with immigrants. There's Iran, there's North Korea. The EU faces deep internal divisions and challenges, and the international environment is ever more complex and more dangerous than it has been for decades. In such a world, continued global leadership on both sides of the Atlantic, with all of its costs, is more necessary than ever. Europe must get its internal security house in order to deal more effectively with terrorism, and must as well increase its investment in defense capabilities. The United States must increase its military capabilities both through spending defense dollars more wisely and finding additional resources to deal with the growing capabilities, both in numbers and technologies, of potential adversaries. But above all, Americans, and especially American leaders, must reject isolationism, whether prompted by the need to address domestic needs or the belief that some of our allies are taking advantage of us. Their inaction must not become an excuse for our own. Contrary to the views of some politicians, continuing American global leadership is in our own economic, political, and security interests, not simply and only an altruistic act. America turning inward not only will make the world more dangerous for others, but also for us. 7 years ago, in presenting this same award to President George H.W. Bush, I quoted him as saying that a peaceful, prosperous world required the leadership, the power, and yes, the conscience of the United States of America. That wisdom is as true today as ever. In a speech at Harvard in September 1943, Winston Churchill told his audience, "The price of greatness is responsibility. The people of the United States cannot escape world responsibility." The United States today is still a great nation, but it cannot and it will not remain great if it seeks to escape responsibility and global leadership. And that message must be carried forward by this audience and all who believe that only if America leads can the Atlantic Alliance and our other friends and allies work together to secure the future. Thank you for this honor.